Wow, wow. This is a marathon and for a really good reason. We sit down for almost 2 hours, which on the podcast we cut in 2 parts. With Henry Dimbleby, who has not only founded a healthy fast food chain, but also served deep in the heart of the UK government. We discuss everything from Donella Meadows on complex systems and what it means for all of us trying to influence these systems and policy and how you actually change policy. And how it was managing in the COVID crisis from within the UK government, keeping food on the shelves in supermarkets and local shops, and trying to drastically improve school meals and their accessibility for children living in poverty in the UK. And there are many. And for many, this is often the only warm and healthy meal they get a day. And a deep dive into the junk food cycle and the differences between ultra-processed food and junk food, and the crazy UPF, ultra-processed food, addiction we are all or mostly have fallen victim to. Get a cup of tea and get ready for the marathon. This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, Investing as if the planet mattered, where we talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land and our sea, grow our food, what we eat, where and consume. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. To make it easy for fans to support our work, we launched our membership community, and so many of you have joined us as a member. Thank you. If our work created value for you, and if you have the means, and only if you have the means, consider joining us. Find out more on gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag. That is gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag. Or find the link below. Welcome to another interview. Today, for sure a full one, so let's see how far we get with the co-founder of the healthy fast food chain Leon, the co-author of the National Food Strategy in the UK, which was absolutely revolutionary, but not completely implemented, and we'll get to that. The lead non-executive or the ex-lead non-executive director at DEFRA through Brexit negotiations, COVID, and the beginning of the Ukraine war, the author of Ravenous, and the co-founder and managing partner of Bramble Partners. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you. Good to be here, Con.
And you know the drill because you listen to our podcast. Thank you for that, by the way. Every now and then, we start always with a personal question. How did it come about that you spend most of your awake hours focused on soil, food, the food system in this case? Like, how did it lead to a focus on food and agriculture for most of your time awake?
So I'd love to say it was a kind of planned thing. My oldest friend, Rowley, who's actually just moved from the city to take a small holding on Dartmoor, which he's rewilding. But he said to me the other day, said, Henry, the most interesting thing you've ever said to me. And at this, I was I perked up. I said, I can't tell me how interesting I am. And then he said, is stuff leads to stuff. And I was like, well, that's a bit disappointing as a maxim. But actually, that's how I've followed my nose. So I studied at University of Physics and Philosophy. My mother, so I've always been quite interested in both kind of science and word, logic and word-based arguments. My mother was a food writer. I loved food. My first job out of university, I didn't do the milk round. I met a chef, a Michelin star, who's a French chef, Bruno Loubet, and he invited me to come and work in his restaurant. So I was a commis chef for a bit. I then, at the time, we had a family newspaper business in southwest London. So I thought I need to find out how newspapers work. So I went to become a journalist. And then I thought I need to understand how business works. So I went to become a management consultant. And then I was out in Japan, working in Japan, and I realized that actually what I really loved was food. And I rang my eventual Leon co-founder, John Vincent, and said, that business that we've been talking about, I'm going to leave this consultancy firm and go and set it up. And he said, well, I'm going to do that too. I'll come with you. And then Leon was it was essentially a selfish business. It was, how can I, the customer, eat fast food that tastes really good, but doesn't make me feel terrible and make me sick?
And this was when, because now we're talking about it like it's a normal thing to say, but that wasn't in the day, because this is not 2-3 years ago.
Yeah, this was 2004. We were actually started a bit early. I mean, we almost never didn't survive because we started too early. But
Lesson learned for all startup founders: momentum is, I would say, almost more important, or more important than the idea and the team, because you need wind in your sails, otherwise you're gonna have a very hard time.
absolute momentum is everything. But then people started asking us. People started saying, like, because of the way we spoke, people started assuming we were organic or this, that, and the other. And we started having to train the staff. Say, if you're asked, is it organic? You have to say, no, it's not. Because the easiest thing when there's a big queue is to say, yes, it is. And then we kind of got more and more into the supply chain. And that kind of began to cause concerns. I was then contacted by a guy called Mark Sainsbury, who actually also is he's now a regenerative farmer, and he's a keen listener to this podcast.
Who introduced us? Shout out to Mark.
Yeah. And so he was running a restaurant called Morrow at the time. He was a chef, and he was finding it incredibly difficult to run a restaurant, which is a difficult thing, and also do everything else. Like, just trying to hire people, make sure the food is hot and tasty and you're not wasting food. And then, my God, I have to deal with all this sustainable stuff as well. I don't even know where to start. And so he said, can you help me set up a not-for-profit, the Sustainable Restaurant Association, which will help restaurants, help people like you and me who are really struggling, just at least do the basics. So we did that. Then I met, at the time, the Secretary of State for Education at someone's house. And we talked a lot about...
As one does, yeah.
As one does. And we talked a lot about food and school food and how it worked and why it was so bad. And he then contacted me and said, look, you're managing to make relatively cheap, good food in a restaurant. Could you help us do it in schools? So that was the first. He asked me to do a government review on school food, which I did with John, my co-founder. And that was the school food plan that led to, among other things, cookery being compulsory on the curriculum for everyone up to the age of 14. It led to universal free school meals for infants in this country.
Which is massive. Let's not forget that for many people in poverty and children in poverty, that's the only proper meal, or even the only a warm meal they get in a day in the UK. So let's really let that sink in.
It's also, in my mind, and we might come on to this about change and the theories of change, but in my mind, regulation's really important, but cultural changes too. And any food system, any vision of a better food system has as part of it children and teachers eating together in school, eating good food at school.
And cooking.
I don't think, and cooking. And we do. So funny enough, out of the back of that, I then I tweeted about a chef, the chef at my kids' school leaving. Did anyone want to come and be chef at my kids' school? An amazing woman called Nicole Pisani got in touch, who at the time was the head chef at Yotam Ottolenghi's high-end restaurant Nopi. And she said, I'll come and do it because I'm fed up with cooking for all these rich people. I want to cook in a school. And she did. And she did it over about 3 years. We worked out how you do it, because it's tough. Anyone who's a parent knows that cooking good food for children and getting them to eat it is not easy. She worked out how to do it. We set up a charity, Chefs in Schools. We now help schools transform their cookery and their food education. And then, still on this kind of random walk, I was still just following my nose thing. I then was asked by the same Secretary of State who asked me to do the school food work, but 7 years later to do the national food strategy. So he said, look, I have put into place the beginnings of a regulation that will start paying people in the UK post-Brexit to farmers to produce public goods, restore nature, sequester biodiversity, rather than paying straightforward subsidies for food. But I am being attacked from all sides by farmers saying, we can't eat butterflies, by health campaigners saying, what about health? By poverty campaigners saying, what about food security? We need something holistic. So that I was then asked to create the National Food Strategy, which was, a 2-year piece of work. I had a team of 20. We had a budget for consultants. We did citizens dialogues all over the country. It was a massive piece of work. And funnily enough, that was where it wasn't until then that it really cemented my kind of the urgency that I felt for transforming the food system. And I kind of sometimes I remember my wife, after our first son George, who's now 16, his birth was pretty medieval. It was a long labor in 2 places, ended up in hospital. In hospital, funny enough, all they could give her after this 24-hour labor was a Chorley wood white sliced bread. So I then broke her out of hospital.
My wife, and if she did it, she let's say the food in the hospitals in Italy is probably okay-ish, but it's not the best thing in there. And like after, in general, I probably together with children, that's the place where you need the best food, the most nourishing, because you just went through, I don't know, many hours of basically running 10 marathons at the same time. And then you get that to recover. Like that's not going to fly. That's not going to go.
It's not, no. I had to sign a waiver saying I accept that I'm taking her out, and I take the risk. Anyway.
Did you smuggle in food or not? Did you smuggle in?
I did. Funnily enough, a friend of mine was cooking, had started a pop-up cook at a pub nearby, so she cooked us some food. But I couldn't lean on her too much. And so I broke her out pretty quickly. But anyway, after that, I remember going for a walk with my wife in the local park, and it was a beautiful spring day, and everyone's just like wandering around with their children. It's all very calm. And she was like, how can these people all just be wandering around when they know what happens to women in labor? Like, how can they? And she was like, I want to scream. I want to go up to people and say, don't you know what's happening? Like, this is what the world's like. And funnily enough, the food strategy did that to me. It really radicalized me on the food system. Like, when you look at it for 2 years and you think, oh my God, this is the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse. It's the biggest cause.
But you knew that before as well. Like, I don't think you...
Yeah,
like,
but there's something about...
why did it hit home? Why did it hit
because
a nerve
I think
at
there's
that
something
point?
about... When you were looking at it for 2 years, and during that period, we had the Glasgow COP. And the Glasgow COP was the biodiversity COP. And food, obviously, is the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse. And food wasn't at the Glasgow COP. It was on the edges. It wasn't in the center. So you're basically saying, doing it for 2 years made me think, why is no one talking about this? Is insane. Like, this is like literally, as a society, this is willful blindness of an absolutely
Driving into a
extreme
car
nature.
crash, yeah.
And so that was, it's a long answer to your first question, which is how I got into this, which is basically, I was like, I was like someone on going out in to a bar, and every so often I'd see another interesting bar across the street, and I'd go there, and I followed my nose, and I ended up suddenly thinking, actually, well, this is the most important thing, and this is what I've got to spend my time doing. I think it also helps being, at the start of it. I think being a chef, loving food, loving cooking, like outside work, the thing I enjoy doing more than anything else is cooking for friends. So, I think that helps as well, the kind of it being not just an academic love, but actually a passion as well.
I think it has to, because otherwise you wouldn't start a Leon if you just saw the opportunity for a healthy fast food. You wouldn't do that in 2004, first of all. And second, like, how can you claim things are tasty if you don't like food yourself? Like, how can you, and for a food strategy or school plans as well, like, school meals, how do you change that if you're not interested yourself, like, intimately in food? And in the food strategy was really focused, obviously, because it was commissioned by the government and meant to be implemented. It was a very concrete, and in the book as well, I definitely highly recommend the book you turned the strategy into. After it wasn't implemented, it became a book. It's very concrete, very easy read, or there's a lot of data, of course, etc., but there's not a data overload. But then How soon did you figure out that this wasn't going to be the strategy? It was going to be another nice plan, really well written, well documented, well researched, and unfortunately not fully implemented. I think there are a few things that were, but just not at the urgency level that you felt, wasn't felt like when you delivered it.
So I knew when I did it that was likely. When I took it on, I knew that was likely to be the case. So with the school food plan, funny enough, with the Secretary of State who commissioned it, Michael Gove, we said to him, we will only do it if you publish it as a plan, not as recommendations. So we're going to negotiate before it gets published on all of the recommendations, and you're going to say these are policy. And he agreed, and he did that, and he was true to his word. With the National Food Strategy, it was clear that wasn't going to be possible. It was too big. You would have to have negotiations with all the different government departments and the prime ministers and the prime minister. And, while I was doing it, I served under 5 secretaries of state for environment, food and rural affairs, and 4 prime ministers.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you said the same person 7 years later. Like, that's a long shot. But after that, it changed. Like the last few years haven't been.
We knew. I said to him when I started, look, you're not going to be here when we publish this. You'll be somewhere else. And so I very consciously thought about doing 2 things with the strategy. One is you create a story, a framework, because policy happens in a very haphazard, tactical way. You never really know. Someone will campaign for something, the pressure will build, and it'll happen. But you need to provide a framework so that when the time comes for politicians to intervene, they have something ready-made that they can go to. And so that story was actually, in my mind, maybe even more important than the specific policies when we did it.
Yeah.
And funny enough, when we published it, my wife, who's a journalist, Jemima Lewis, who had helped behind the scenes edit it, the food strategy, said, look, no one is going to read a government document online. We've got to turn this into a book. And so we wrote the book together, and we wrote it so that our 16-year-old son could understand it. So that was the first kind of piece, was the story and those kind of big concepts. So the junk food cycle, the invisibility of nature, the 3-compartment model, those kind of big concepts that we were establishing. And then secondly, there were policies. There's like a list of policies now. Now, actually, I think the government on the environmental side, although some of it they're doing quite silently, are doing most of on the farming side. Slowly, surely, they're doing most of the policies there. And I think that I've spoken to the Labour government. People are probably coming in to power this year, and I think that will continue. They're not doing anything on health. They've gone backwards on health. So I knew people kind of look at me slightly sadly sometimes and say, "Oh, poor you. You did all this work." And I'm like, no. I knew that was what I've done it before. I knew that's what I got in for, and I was in it for the long term. Yeah.
And we'll get to those pieces in a bit. What do you think is needed? Because you write somewhere in the book as well, like, government will act at some point. The question is how much of a mess will be in when they do, when they see the immense healthcare costs, the immense environmental costs of the current food system. What is needed, or have you seen that within government as well, like to land this urgency, to really spark the like, this is an absolute car, like a train crash waiting to happen, and we're driving right into it and we're not doing anything. We're focusing on other stuff. What would be needed? We've seen it with pesticides, for instance. We had an interview a long time ago, or a while ago, and like pesticide regulation doesn't really happen very well because of very strong lobbying powers, et cetera, et cetera. And in Japan, they managed to pass some very strict ones because they tested the parliamentarians on pesticide residue. They took hair. They asked them, and they took hairs. They researched that, and specifically they asked also to test the children of them. And once they did that, suddenly people it hit home because they noticed that you had quite a bit of exposure to certain pesticides and herbicides. And what do you think is needed to? In the UK, you can only speak obviously for the UK, but also other governments, to land that urgency, to have that awakening moment. They're not going to spend 2 years like you did to go deep, plus the whole journey you had before.
So interesting. I was for a similar thing. I was tested. I had my hair and blood tested few weeks back for pesticide refuge. I'm absolutely riddled with them. So that campaign is starting here in the UK, I think, in a few weeks' time. So I
What
think
does it
that
do
if
to
you
you?
look at,
Sorry, one step back. How does it make you feel?
yeah, it was weird because they said we know this is like we know we're going to find it, and I think it's just like it makes me feel. I think we're kind of. It's like also the fact that my body's full of microplastics. It's just like, and I think that we're going, down the line, and I talk about this a bit in the book about UPF, ultra processed food versus junk food, and that kind of how you think about the difference. I think down the line, with the improvement in computing power, which is going to enable us to understand complex systems more and more, and in a way that we really don't today, I think we will see that so many of the things that beset us, from depression to inflammation are going to be caused by these micropollutants. And I try not to think about it too much personally, to be honest.
No, otherwise you get too worried.
It makes me feel sad. It's sad.
You for sure cook mostly from scratch. You try to eat very
almost,
well.
Yeah, I cook.
Still.
I cook no process. Hardly the most processed food that I cook will be a tin of mussels or maybe a sriracha sauce, probably occasionally.
But that's in category 2 of the ultra processed level. That doesn't.
I think probably the sriracha you could probably argue is ultra processed. But I now make my own. I make my own kimchi. Make my own.
Anyway, going back to the government piece, I interrupted you on the pesticide.
So the question is, what do you need to do it? So I think what will happen? The only way this happens is it gets worse and worse, and then there are specific political moments like the one you described in Japan that happen to cut through. I don't think you can know in advance
That's
what those moments
right?
are.
Yeah, we don't know. Yeah.
So, and to give you an example, with the food strategy, we published a part 1 during COVID about food poverty, which had some recommendations on food poverty. I sent that to a wonderful man called Ed Woodward, who at the time was the CEO of Manchester United,
the football/soccer club for
football
people
team,
in North
and
America.
the Manchester United striker Marcus Rashford had been doing some campaigning on food poverty, and I said, "Could you give this to Marcus? I think he'd be interested in reading it." I expected to hear nothing, and then after the summer that year, Marcus Rashford's team got in touch and said, Marcus wants to campaign for your recommendations because he thinks it's really important. He grew up on free school meals. He understands the importance of food, and then so he did that. We did a kind of campaign together. Pressure built, and in the October of that year, the UK government agreed that there would be permanently free school meals and activities available for all children on free school meals during the holidays in the UK. So there's no way that I could have known that would happen, but it did. So in the background, when I talk about the kind of things getting worse, I think that is, what do I mean by that? I think it's inevitable. So if you take, for example, climate change, this winter has been a real wake-up call for farmers, I think that farmers had been a group, if you go back historically, who were probably a bit more climate change, skeptical than other groups. But when you're looking out of your window and you're seeing that half your farm's been underwater for 3-4 months, that's pretty hard to do. And then you think at the moment in the UK, agriculture is responsible for about 12% of greenhouse gas emissions. By 2030, the government estimates that agriculture is going to be responsible for 50% of our emissions because it's the only sector of the economy that is not reducing its emissions. So as energy and transport reduce, the kind of focus on agriculture is only going to increase. that will happen with biodiversity as we get better at measuring it. So I think you'll have this combination of like the red light on the dashboard is going to be bleeping, it's going to be flashing louder and louder and louder, and that will lead at some point to moments which will lead to policy intervention. And I want to say just one more thing about Europe at the moment, because a lot of people say, farmer protests in Europe. When we were in Brussels together, RFSI, the farmers were in good spirits, burning tires up the road, and generally, causing merry mayhem. And people say, "Oh, yeah, everything is being pulled back on. This is a disaster. This is the end of the environmental transition on food." And actually, I don't believe that's the case. If you look at the specifics of what those farming protests have been about, they've actually, individual cases, been quite a lot of bad legislation done with good intentions. So the flashpoints, whether it's putting tax on red diesel, on farmer diesel in Germany, or forced purchasing Dutch dairy farms and closing them down, or not creating a land use framework in Wales and saying instead that all farmers need to plant 10% of their farms with trees, regardless of what kind of soil they're on. Those are all kind of really unnecessary adjutants unnecessary kind of clumsy moves in the name of doing the right thing. And so I actually think we're in just a little period. And if you look at what's kind of been pulled back on in Europe, there is some important stuff, but I think it's like much more like, a step back to better to jump. There's that French expression, isn't there? I can't remember. Pour mieux sauter. I can't remember. You step back.
You worked in a French restaurant. I didn't. I don't know.
Yeah. So I am actually think that the tide is going in the right direction. I think on health, that's not necessarily the case. So I think on health, it's quite possible that we end up drugging our way out of the problem. And we've maybe come on to health. I don't know. But just to say, I was speaking to an American consultant the other day, and he with big clients in the States, and he was reflecting on the three groups who are interested in the health food transition. He said that the fast-moving consumer good companies are absolutely terrified. They've seen the effect of semaglutide, Wegovy, Ozempic on sales of their junk food.
That's the weight loss drug.
Appetite suppressant
from Denmark mostly, right? It's Novo
exactly at the moment. But there are Novo Nordisk, but there are now, which is now the most valuable company in Europe. But there are 5 or 6 different
ones. So
they've
seen already that. So we're making a national transition to health. They've seen that simple.
They've already seen the decline in.
Wow.
Yeah, they've seen the decline in sales. Wait for it. They've tried everything. They've tried pricing. It doesn't work. These people just aren't hungry. You can't sell them the stuff. So they made them hungry
to begin with the ultra processed food. But we'll get to that.
Yeah. So they are terrified. The drugs companies are absolutely licking their lips. They're like, this is going to be absolute. Also, literally, the drugs companies think they're going to see the profits that the fast-moving consumer good companies used to make move across to them. And the only people who are serious in the private sector who are seriously worried about it are the insurers, because the insurers, if the fast-moving consumer goods companies win, have to pay their health bills. And if the drug companies win, they have to pay for the drugs. Apparently the only people in the States who are thinking about how do we change the system? How do we actually
let's get cheaper medicine?
Fundamentally, are the insurance companies.
Food. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's say I'm speaking for the sector, which I don't, but definitely our friends are maybe partly the fast-moving consumer goods that are trying to figure out what to sell, but mostly the insurance that either way are going to pick up the bill. And if we can show prevention is cheaper and prevention is done with real healthy food, that might be an interesting combination, because these pharma companies, the medicine companies, are not going to sell this cheaply. I think there's no way. If they have gold, they will make sure you pay for it.
I think it's not just the cost as well. So I think over time competition will kick in. You know,
But you
and
mentioned in
so
your
over
book
time,
crisis, which were interesting, let's say. I mean, it's really the happy few. These are
yeah, it
not
is at the
cheap
moment,
medicines.
and you can't get hold of the drugs that were originally to modify insulin for diabetics, and there are shortages for those. At the moment, we're at the peak of the price, but they will come down. But talking to kind of doctors in this space, the problem is not just the price. The problem is these drugs effectively are replicating. It's a bit, funny enough, that it's a bit like the Green Revolution. So it's a bit like, you take a complex system and you hack it with nitrogen and pesticides, and in the short term you get huge yields,
But
but you build up other problems. And these drugs are doing exactly the same. They're going into an incredibly complex system of hormones that regulate our bodies, and they are replicating one hormone, not always the same. In the case of semaglutide, it's GLP-1, and overriding one bit of the system. But these hormones have evolved through random mutation and selection, and every hormone in our body plays multiple roles. We don't even understand half of what they do.
are you
And so
saying
the
that we
idea that you
oversimplified the hormone
yeah, so it's
side
exactly that. So
and
for
say it's
me, there's a
fine?
real parallel on the health side with what happened in the Green Revolution on the nature side and on the farming side.
Yeah, which if you're interested in, I mean, that's fascinating. I just saw a paper who shared it. Eric Smith of Audacious, actually, on the unintended consequences, not saying there's a big conspiracy or anything, but on the Green Revolution piece, especially, I think it was rice and wheat in India, and the level of arsenic and the low level of nutrients now in the rice crops, etc. There are a lot of consequences when you hack a system to its simple form, and it might take 60 years, it might take 10 years, it might take 5, we don't know. But this has been experimented at such a large scale now, and it's doing magic. Like, let's be honest, like people that couldn't lose weight until now, we've tried everything under the sun, and it works. Like, it really works. So let's also not underestimate that.
No, and so I say I am not, I am not a purist. So for me, if you have an evolved, we all know that 70% of weight is to do with appetite, evolved appetite, genetics. You can track it through genes. And if you have genes that give you a propensity to react badly to the system, and you've got a BMI of over 40 and all your life you've been absolutely miserable and it's affected your mental health, these drugs are fantastic, and I would not, I would suggest that if you're in that situation, it's worth talking to your doctor about, because it's just, I know people who've been on them and it's completely changed their lives, but they are not the solution. They're not the long-term solution to the overall problem with the food system. We need simultaneously to change the system.
And so we can spend a lot more time on the health side and the junk food cycle, but I know we're also going to cover that in a future interview with an intro you made with Chris, who wrote the Ultra Processed People book, and maybe other interviews in that space. But just to introduce the junk food cycle and why there's a difference, why we keep eating what we shouldn't be eating, or what isn't good for us. Like, why is the junk food cycle so important, and why is it? Until now, it seems like we're in an inflection point, probably also mainly in the UK because of this book, but at other places as well. But why until now we just didn't talk about the junk food cycle enough, especially in governmental, like it needs regulation in governmental regions?
Yeah, so I think it's worth so let me answer that question. I think, first of all, you have to, why did we use these two phrases, the junk food cycle and the invisibility of nature? And that was driven by the work of Jay Forrester, Donella Meadows at MIT in the 50s, this creation of system dynamics. And I was introduced to that by a man called Ian Boyd, who was the chief scientific officer at DEF at the time. He is he's a biologist. He looks at energy transfer in complex systems. So literally, he looks at how photons come from the sun and then get moved about between animals and plants in biological systems.
And mycelium. And let's not forget the fungi. Sorry, the flora, fauna, and fungi.
And fungi, and all the other.
Otherwise, I get emails. There are 3 Fs: flora, fauna, and fungi.
And all the other things in between. Because let's again, we're foolish to think that there are distinct barriers between these various different life forms. So he does that, and he said, look, one of the few forms of science that's come from business into biology is this study of system dynamics, because what you notice with complex systems is in any walk of life, the mathematics of them are similar and they break down in similar ways. And what you need to do, rather than just saying, oh my God, this is really complicated, you need to identify the feedback loops that are going wrong. And in the food system, luckily, there are two feedback loops that are going so badly wrong that we concluded that any policy effort has to try and fix those. One was the junk food cycle, and this is the fact that we haven't, and this is, you can look at the science of this, we have an appetite that evolved a long time ago at a time when foods were scarce. And we get a disproportionate amount of pleasure from eating foods that are high in sugar, salt, fat. Our body wants us to go out and climb the tree to get the honey, to get the beehive down and get stings. It wants us to go out and risk life and limb to kill an animal that's got fat on it, because that is the nutritious stuff and that would give us a competitive advantage. And when those foods are largely two things that are only really the case in modern foods now. One is low in water, calorie dense, because most ultra processed food has got a lot of the water taken out of it. The other is low in insoluble fiber. They fill us up less, we eat more, and food companies know this. We eat more, and
that's why they're so scared of this medicine. Yeah,
yeah, they spend more and more money on, and we eat more. They spend more, we get sick. 85% of the products produced by the big fast-moving consumer good companies are too unhealthy to market to children. In the UK, we spend £2.2 billion a year on fresh fruit and veg, and £3.9 billion a year on confectionery, on sweets, which is one. So this stuff has completely overtaken the food system. It's like,
and it hacked our system. Like, it's made with ingredients. It was already before, but even the last 10, 20 years, like the food science and the palatability and the breaking, and we'll get into that when we have Chris here. But it's so well engineered to, like, it's not you cannot stop eating this because it's engineered to make you fill you up completely. And
exactly, particularly, you've got to remember, particularly with certain genes. So if you are someone who is naturally doesn't, you just have to imagine what you feel like when you haven't eaten for a day. And that is how someone with different genes might feel if they're eating that kind of food after a few hours. So cannot,
it's a drug.
It's a drug.
And we shouldn't stigmatize. I think there's a very important piece there, like obese, etc., which is now 60% of the US.
Yeah,
it's not their fault.
Interestingly, what I think is interesting about, so we use the word junk food cycle to describe this. It's what's known in system dynamics terms as an escalating feedback loop. Like, you shout, I shout louder, you shout, I shout louder, and we end up just yelling our heads off at each other. And that's what's gone on. This escalating feedback loop means the food system is almost completely dominated by this stuff. But we talked about ultra-processed food in the food strategy, but we use the term junk food cycle because the cycle reflected the feedback loop. But what I think is interesting about ultra-processed food, the framing of it, is that junk food is, in our cultures, is kind of a slightly guilty treat. It's a naughty little thing. Let's have a cheeky McDonald's. And so we feel, well, it's our fault because junk food, we love it, and we're a bit naughty, but let's do it. Ultra processed food, although the mechanisms are the same as I've just described, reveals, I think, a fundamental political truth, or kind of framing truth, which is, it's not a cheeky thing. It is the system. It is the man fucking with you. It is those big companies, for the profit motive, destroying the health of large swathes of society. And that's why I think ultra processors really cut through, because it's no longer it's cheeky junk food. It's, oh my God, this is what these people are doing to us. And that's why I think we were talking earlier on about Eddie Abu, who's this.
People are going to be bored because I keep bringing him up in like every interview now. But you made me discover Eddie. Talk about Eddie.
I introduced you to Eddie Abu. And actually, I was introduced to him by Chris Van Tulleken, who wrote Ultra Processed People, and he's this he's this weightlifter, former bodybuilder, and all he does is he goes on his Instagram and it's just so obviously true. So one of the ones I love most is where he goes down with his camera in a supermarket along an aisle of Mother's Day chocolates that goes on for meters and meters of Mother's Day chocolates, and he's like, guys, why are you giving this to your mother for Mother's Day? You're trying to kill her. Are you trying to get your inheritance early? And then he goes like, this is shit. And then he always turns to the camera and goes, wake the fuck up. And I do think that what people like Chris and Eddie Abu and Tim Spector have done is like, it's just like, wake up. This is nuts. And this is the system messing with us. And so I think that is what I think, the mechanism is the junk food cycle, the mechanism an escalating feedback loop. But from a framing point of view, I think ultra processed
is a
really
better word. Yeah. In. Would you change the word?
And actually, and it's not just the UK now. So I was talking. I had dinner the other day with a Spanish friend who is the president of a big Spanish food company, and they are trying, and it's privately owned, but it's big, billions of euros, and they are moving because they can, because they're privately owned. They've got like a 5-year, 10-year program to move all of their food away so it's not ultra processed and move into different categories. And he says that in Spain, it's absolutely cut through as well, this idea of ultra processed food. So it's not just
Is this a moment? Is this a moment?
It's a moment. I think it's a moment. Now,
it's one of the things we discussed previously, like with the pesticide law in Japan. Like, is this one of those?
So exactly. Is it a moment? We don't know. Like, everyone thought that COVID would be a moment,
and then it wasn't. Yeah.
And we were all like, we can change. This is like, we've interfered.
We're all baking at home. We're fine.
But also just the level of interference in the food system. The government suspended competition law.
You were there when that happened. Yeah.
So like there was an Overton window about, oh my God, we're hardly interfering at all normally. This is the moment. And then it wasn't the moment, and then it's just like we all forgot about it.
Now let's talk about it, because you were in that control room. Now it's kind of a weird
fever dream, this memory of the time when we were all locked up. But
you were in that control room almost during COVID, because you were non-executive director of DEFRA, and you were on these morning calls at 8:30 with the whole food system in the UK to try to keep supermarket shelves open and food to hospital workers and things like that. How was it being in that? And then when did you see that moment wasn't the moment?
So I remember it. I remember going into sitting and observing COBRA meetings, which was the kind of the center of government that was running the COVID response in February. I actually thought in February, I realized now I caught COVID because I got in February 22 because I got tested and I had the antibodies before I had the vaccine. But at the time in February, all my lymph nodes swelled up, and we were talking about COVID coming over, and we now know
2020, for the history.
Yeah, 2020. Yeah. We now know it was in the center of government, and my lymph nodes swelled up so much that the doctor thought I might have cancer, and I went to have an emergency biopsy, and I didn't have a cancer. And the doctor said, it's weird, I don't know what, it must be some weird virus. And like that was February. So we were talking about it, but it wasn't real to us then. So, so anyway, so we were kind of talking about COVID, but it wasn't real. Like that we were living in this kind of slight fantasy land. And then I got a text or a call, I can't remember which, from an amazing man called Richard Pennycook, who was another lead non-exec in government and who had been the CEO of the Co-op supermarkets. And he texted me and said, Henry, just with your DEFRA hat on, do we know that if we went into lockdown that we would be able to feed everyone in the UK?
Good question. Very good question.
So I then texted our permanent secretary, Tamara Finkelstein, another amazing woman who, like, when the behind the scenes story of COVID is written, she will be one of the great heroes. And I said, Tamara, I just got this question. Do we know? And she was like, no, I'm not sure we do. And at that point, I was like, well, do you think we should? Yeah, I think we probably should. So then with
just
Richard's
in
help,
case we're going to close everything, just like in the rare 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, everything was
yeah, exactly. Well, it was 2-3 weeks after this, but it seemed like unimaginable.
I
at the
remember,
time.
like we were talking with, and we still make fun of that. One of our cousins or aunts was like, "Yeah, but I don't know, this school trip with children." This was in February or end of January, and we were like, "Of course it's gonna happen," but and this was in Italy, and northern Italy was already very clear that stuff wasn't, but it was like, oh, sort of contained. Of course, it wasn't in a few villages, and we're like, of course, this school trip is gonna happen. Don't worry, and we're like, oh, you're panicking, and then 2 weeks later, the whole country was in lockdown.
Yeah,
like,
and so anyway, so we then. Richard recommended a kind of industry veteran called Chris Tyus, who was a stalwart throughout this process. And there was a senior civil servant called David Kennedy, who was an absolute hero. We set up this thing called FRIF, the Food Resilience Industry Forum, suspended competition law because there's very strong competition law to stop collusion in the UK. And David and Chris ran these 8:30 a.m. conference calls every morning, which were fascinating, and they kept the food moving. So the two biggest issues were, one was that normally 25% of the calories we eat out of home, so we eat it in restaurants and cafes and coffee shops, and suddenly you had to find a way to get that food into those calories into the main system, which when you're, for example, eating croissant in a coffee shop that's been made in a factory with huge bags of flour, you suddenly have these huge bags of flour. Everyone's baking at home. You can't sell these huge. Where do you There were conversations about how can we get enough small bags to put the flour into small bags to get it from the. So that was going on, and then the other thing that was going on was people stopped eating at the big supermarkets buying in the big supermarkets in town and started shopping much more at their corner shops and so literally they were having discussions about how can we get the food from that would normally going to Tesco, Sainsbury, etc., Morrison's to the cost cutter in someone's local village. And so that was and what you learned from that was that the food system we've got, for all its faults, is pretty amazing. I mean, when you wanted it to shift, it shifted very quickly. And there was, if you look at the food shortages that we had, they were all to do with the amount of stock people held and panic buying, and we got food to everyone. Now, it was it was a man-made locking down was a man-made intervention, and therefore women, people, and therefore we could make the changes to make that okay. So so I think it's different. People say, well, if we solve that crisis, we can solve the climate crisis, a different kind of crisis, because we were locking things down, and therefore we could open it up. I remember there was this, we talk about it in the book, but there was this very early on, there was a rumor that hit the market that
lemons,
the price of lemons spiked, and there was a rumor that hit the market the Spanish had closed the border, and that would have been a nightmare because at that time of year, over 50% of our fruit and veg was coming from Southern Europe. And I rang a man called Sir John Shropshire, who runs G's, which is one of our biggest horticulture companies, and he has farms in the UK and Spain and Morocco. And I said, John, is it true that the border's closed with Spain? Because this is really problematic if it is, and we need to get the Foreign Office talking to Spain fast. And he said, oh, just let me have a look. And he looked at the GPS monitors on his trucks. So no, they're still going. I can see them. They're going. I see one going across the border now. They're not stuck at the border. And what had happened was a Turkish hand sanitizer company, because obviously there's a massive boom in hand sanitizer, had bought up all the lemons to perfume the hand sanitizer, and that had caused the spike. So that's a great example of how interconnected and how strangely connected the system is, and how you never really know what's going to happen when you act on it until you see how it reacts.
And this is going to be a bridge, and because we have so much else to discuss, and let's see how far we got. But we talked about the junk food cycle. Did we cover an invisibility of nature enough? I don't think so yet. Like that as a big piece.
No, so I should talk about the
big piece as well. And then we get through the 3-compartment model because we have a lot to explore there as well. But let's get to the nature piece and invisibility.
So we talked about health, junk food cycle. The feedback loop that is going wrong on the environmental side is even more obvious. And Siddhartha Dasgupta, who's a Cambridge economist, was asked to write a piece for the Treasury in the UK called The Economics of Biodiversity.
Massive piece, fundamentally important, yeah.
Extraordinary piece of work. And he pointed out that nature is invisible. And he says, and he calls it the invisibility of nature, and he says, not only is nature actually quite hard to measure, so it's often underground, it's literally invisible, it's underground, it's underwater, it's in the air, it's silent, it moves about, it doesn't sit waiting to be measured. But we don't even try. So in most of the ways in which we measure human success, nature is invisible in those measurements. So, and he uses the example of, you can't count it in your wallet. It's not on the balance sheet of companies. It's not in the way that we measure GDP. And in fact, he points out that it's worse than that. Governments globally give subsidies to a value of $500 billion a year to activities that destroy nature, the 3 largest ones being fossil fuel companies, fishing companies, and industrial agricultural companies. And those subsidies cause $4 to $6 trillion of damage to nature. So it's not that, as we all know, if you give something as a free resource, people will consume it and produce things from it. We're actually giving a negative value nature. We're paying people to destroy it. So in that context, we shouldn't be surprised if we are consuming it at a great rate. And Dasgupta, even in that thing, he has this amazing mathematical proof of the rate at which we are consuming nature and our economic growth, where he goes on to estimate when we will become extinct if we carry on doing these things at the same time, because that is the inevitable, that we're consuming nature faster than we're producing economic growth. So we're just mining, we're destroying nature to produce economic growth. Now, in some ways, that's quite positive, because we know what the answer is. The answer is you stop paying people to destroy nature. You say we now need to, you do 3 things. You say we need to set a target, not just to stop the destruction of nature, but to restore it. Net gain, natural capital net gain, as it's known. We need to pay public money for public goods. So for things that are where there's no private market, such as biodiversity, clean air, etc., we need to pay people we need to pay people to create those goods for the public. So that's, in many ways, that's good news, because there's a very clear feedback loop that's going wrong, and it is within the state's purview. You don't have this complicated thing of a biological evolved appetite, making this more complicated. The state can simply change the way that it regulates farming, and theoretically there are 3 things that it has to do. First of all, it has to set a target for biodiversity net gain. It is not enough to stop destroying biodiversity where it is. We need significantly to increase it if we're going to create resilient ecological systems. The second thing, once you've set that target, is you make it come into being by paying public money for public goods. So you for those goods that there's no private market for, biodiversity, clean water, and so forth, you actually pay people to deliver those goods. And then the third thing is you introduce a polluter pays principle. So you charge people for the harm they do to nature, which in the end stops them, either enables you to clear up the harm or stops them doing that thing. So you have those 3 tools that you use. You have to be careful about how you implement them politically, because At the moment, the FAO.
Hence the riots. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the moment, the FAO, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, estimates, and the estimates that we did for the UK were similar to this, that the food system, it's 12% of global GDP. It employs over a third of the people. It's about 12 trillion of GDP, and the FAO estimates that it does about $12.7 trillion worth of damage. So if you were to put the polluter pays principle in overnight, you would double the price of food, and you'd be kicked out of government within a week. So you had to be careful about how you manage that transition. But the root is there. Then the question we asked is, what does the future look like? So if there's some kind of imaginary equation that says, how can I use the land that I have to restore biodiversity, produce food, produce energy, sequester carbon?
And you have doesn't mean a farm. In this case, it's the country of the United Kingdom. Like, you have to look at a large scale.
The scarcest asset we have, or ideally you do it globally, but that's obviously not possible because we have the nation state. But so you say, how should I be using my land? Like, what is the best way to use the land? And what's interesting here is the debate that was ferociously raging when we started doing the food strategy work was the kind of scientists who talked about land sparing. So they talked about, no, we need to double down on intensification. That will enable us to take land out of production, which we can give back to nature. And that's the way we solve this problem, double down on the science. And then you had the regenerative farmers, organic regenerative. At the time, regenerative was more nascent than it is now. It's still not fully defined.
Some regenerative farmers are offended if you call them organic. But...
Exactly. So, so you had that whole culture war as well. But you basically, they were saying, no, we need land sharing. We need our farms to share nature with the farm. And actually, the work that we did said you can solve that problem. You can restore nature, sequester carbon, produce enough food, create energy. But you have to realize that farms have been with us for so long that actually land sparing on its own does not work, because there are whole ecosystems that have evolved to live on farms. We've been farming since the Holocene, since 10,000 BC for 12,000 years. And there are whole ecosystems that actually have evolved on farms. So if you had land sparing alone, doubling down on intensification and creating wildland, there actually wouldn't be room for these species, these whole ecosystems.
So you're saying, like, if we grow all the food in factories, which is sometimes the pipe dream of some of this, the techno-optimists, then actually we lose some biodiversity because they have co-involved with farming, greatly disappeared to a certain extent. Like the biodiversity loss on farms, but there are species that simply wouldn't survive that wilder place because they're not co-involved to be in a wilder place.
Not just some, 50% of habitable land, if you take away desert and icy areas, 50% is farmed at the moment. So this is a huge, like, if you just grew all your food, precision fermented all your food and grew it in vertical farms, you would just wipe out a whole bunch of nature. Now, the flip side of this is that actually, with current yields, you do need to have some intensive farming. And by intensive farming, we did not mean green revolution. We don't mean nitrogen, synthetic fertilizer, etc. What we mean is monocultures. So in order to get the yields up, you do need some areas that are just growing wheat in a field that are largely monocultures. Now, increasingly, those will be, and some people hate this phrase, sustainable intensification, but you need to use all the tools at your disposal on those fields. So you won't be able to have Haber-Bosch created fertilizer over time. So there are if you look at even now, a lot of the intensive farmers are already beginning to use the regenerative toolbook, because there are things that help you grow, at
better, cheaper.
Higher, but you cannot build. We could not find any kind of mathematical way that using the strictest version of regenerative farming, so quite broad rotations, ruminants in that rotation, etc., etc. You could produce enough food. So we called this, and I slightly think maybe we got the name of it wrong, but I'll come on to that. So we called it the 3-compartment model. So you basically have wild land, 1 compartment, really kind of land where you intentionally reduce the yield to bring nature onto the farm, another compartment. And then the more intensive land where your number one goal is to produce as many calories as you can, but with total factor productivity. So without polluting, without releasing a lot of carbon, etc.
And that seems where the challenge is, right? But it's also most excitement. Like if we figure that third piece out, we not only tackle the techno-optimist, you cannot feed the world, blah, blah, blah. I think there's an enormous toolbox we haven't been using because we've been focused on a few relatively cheap inputs that we could get for a number of time. And that's okay. Now we move away from that. That's where the challenge is. Okay, show us how much you can squeeze. I think we only scratch the surface in terms of production numbers. If you really unleash the creativity we have with all your compost teas, but brewed at scale in a brewery, all your precision drones and all your machinery, like there's so much possible in that third piece that allows all the others, of course, to happen, because we still have to feed a lot of people and probably more in the time to come.
Yeah, eight maybe go up to 10 billion people. And so, but actually the reason I have kind of slight reservations about the 3-compartment model as a framing is 2 things. First of all, it's more of a continuum. It's not like there's a hard line, and it's a complex system. The second is that there are people who have seized on the 3-compartment model say, oh, well, I can go on doing what I always did. And, we need this industrial agriculture.
Especially people in the third one, I think.
And you can't, because you can't continue to pollute, and you can't continue to use all of this. You can't continue to mine our food. We cannot mine our food. One way of looking at it, 30 to 50% of the calories we currently produce rely on Haber-Bosch produced fertilizer. So we're effectively mining millions of years of stored sunlight to produce a lot of our food at the moment. That cannot continue. So you cannot have business as usual. But basically you also can't have. I mean, I've talked to Patrick Holden, who was now runs Sustainable Food Trust, and they did a piece of work where they looked at if you had effectively organic systems, the whole of the UK in an organic system, could you produce enough food? And they said, well, you could, but we'd have to eat almost no chicken or pork, more beef. I look at that model, it's still quite carbon intensive. We couldn't make that work. So we could not make a kind of what a lot of us romantically like the idea of, like, because it fills our soul, settles peace on our soul, this idea of a kind of completely, organic or nature-based model without any modern science. We couldn't make that work. And funnily enough, I was at a fascinating conference, again, that Mark Sainsbury had organized.
Before we go there, because I know that's fascinating, I think that without any modern science is a interesting phrase there, because the cutting edge farmers I know, some organic, certified, some not, etc., they're so not far ahead of science, but they're definitely at the cutting edge of science. Not that but it's a different type of science, or it's a different holistic is such a bad word for this, but it's definitely trying to figure out how biology works, not how you squeeze as much in with. So I think, I don't know Patrick personally at all, so I don't want to say, but I think without science, it's tricky there, because the cutting edge now, and we see that with Jonathan Landgren, USDA top scientist, left because he said the cutting edge stuff is happening on a farm and I need to start a farm and a research institute. But I cannot do that from the USDA because the cutting edge is happening on farms and it doesn't fit in my models. And so there's let's be very clear, agroecology and regen is not anti-science. It's one of those narratives that I
couldn't agree more. And actually, and I probably traduced Patrick there and been unfair on his view. So I actually think, again, with the computing power that we're beginning to have, that what had been seen as old wisdom is actually really good science. It's just we haven't been able to understand it in the limited way that we understand science. And so I think you will see emerging that understanding how the soil works, those complex systems, will become increasingly possible because we'll actually
How
be able to
tree
understand
grows.
them.
Like we see examples of speed and growth numbers in complex agroforestry systems that are completely unheard of. If you look at the models, if you look at like that's not possible. And it's not possible because we have never studied them in that way. So that's the other, but like we're such at the early stage, like in that third piece. And I'm also very fascinated about the wilding piece, like how much management and intervention needs that first bit of the bucket, let's say. I'm sort of less interested in the second because I don't know, we figured it out. We're like, okay, we know how to bring back nature, et cetera, et cetera. But that third one is how do we intensify while getting fossil fuels basically out of the system? Not in one day, let's not do Sri Lanka, but how do we transition to that? How do we get way more tools in our toolbox? I think that's the excitement piece. That's the excitement from investor point of view, from food security, from quality as well, and from biodiversity, because that's where you have the most acreage at the moment, and you can have the most impact by undersowing, by a bit of complexity from a monoculture perspective. Like it makes a massive difference in a lot of the super, super degraded, because most of the farmland we see is like it's dead basically in terms of biodiversity and in terms of soil life. Like there's where the biggest impact will be.
I agree. And I completely agree. And I also think we don't know where this is going to end up. So the most important thing is that people are talking. And that was why I was saying this conference in Cambridge.
How was that? Yes,
I went to, which was half, it was at the Sainsbury laboratory. So half people who'd spent their lives genetically modifying, now genetically editing crops, and half regenerative farmers. And most of them descended on each other in the middle to say, how can we help each other solve this problem? Like we know what the problem is. We can't continue to pollute. We need to understand the complex systems. And, all of those geneticists actually really understand complex systems because they understand how complex just one plant is. And so I'm very hopeful that it's all about exploring knowledge, understanding complex systems and how we can use that to produce food in a less destructive way and a more nutritious way. Funny enough, you talked about...
I think the three compartments, I think the question, if it's perfect or not, it's a continuum. That all true. But I think asking the question what to do where and why is something we never do in policy, never do in farming. We always look on a farm to farm level, more or less, like the Wales example, like everybody has to plant 10%. Doesn't make sense probably for most, but in some it could make sense to do way more.
Exactly.
Like that question of, okay, what do we do where? What makes sense where? Culturally, context, soil, weather, climate, and how do we grow the most with the least damage or with the most positive side? Because actually we see in agroforestry, the more you prune properly, the faster the soil regrows. Like there is a positive keystone aspect to us if you manage well, but the question is where you do what, and you have to have a good reason. And I don't think any government has done that on even a country level.
No, and I mean the UK now, England, is doing a land use framework, so they're trying to understand that. My guess is when they do it, they will not make it. It'll be very difficult to publish it without it being incredibly controversial. So I'll be quite careful about that. And then the other thing that we have to be quite humble about is it's going to change the way it makes farm regulation and payments much more complicated because you don't really know what impact a policy has until the system reacts to it. So there's a good example in the UK at the moment where they've just in January, they increased the payment for species-rich grassland. Everyone thinks they probably paid a bit too much for it. So it's so it's like some horticulture is not being planted because you make more money. And they're going to have to change. So actually, the line I think is, I always come back to is Donella Meadows' book. And if her book, which is the kind of the book about complex systems. And she says, what we have to understand about complex systems is, first of all, you cannot control them. Number one. Number two, it is actually, they are in some ways fundamentally unknowable. You can't really understand them, but you can dance with them. And that is what all these regenerative farmers are doing. That is what people who are working in is they are dancing with the system. They're trying things, seeing how their dance partner responds, trying something else. And that is hard enough for a farmer at a farm level who understands his or her farm and is dancing with that farm. But it is even harder for the state. So there's going to be there'll be a lot of mistakes, and we have to, I think, all be humble and have forgiveness and let the politicians and the people who are devising the new way of incentivizing things make mistakes and change, and give them the space that we all have in our lives when we're trying to dance with the complex systems that we did to make mistakes.
And let's go to a topic that's in your book a lot. I mean, of course, in the regen space, it's present, which is animal protein. You already mentioned another research of Patrick with especially ruminants versus non-ruminants. I think it's very clear from your analytics, like we have to reduce meat consumption and thus production, not that we have to produce it and throw it away. And you now name a number of pieces, but I'd also have seen, I think in the past, like it hasn't been really, maybe we have reached peak meat to a certain extent, but we haven't seen strong reductions. Like, first of all, why is it so important in the UK context to reduce animal protein consumption? And then some examples or some ideas, some directions of how to achieve that.
So the problem with meat is just that it is an incredibly, the way in which we currently produce meat is very inefficient. What do I mean by that? Well, the 80 billion animals that we rear annually for meat and for dairy products weigh twice as much as all humans at any one time, 20 times as much as all land-dwelling vertebrates and birds. In the UK, 85% of the farmland that we have is used either to grow feed for animals or to graze them. In the EU, 62% of crops are used either to feed to biodigesters or to feed to animals. Globally, 75% of our land is used to feed animals. It's just too much. If we're going to restore biodiversity, sequester carbon, we cannot basically put that food through, the bodies of large, heavy methane producing animals to produce food. And so things like dairy, if you look at dairy, over 60% of the dairy that China imports, for example, is imported in the form of milk powder. It just cannot be right that so you could argue that we shouldn't be having milk powder and that's to do with ultra processed food. But what we argued was you're not going to change it overnight. And in the meantime, it cannot be right that for that milk powder, if you can produce it by fermenting it from bacteria, that you don't do that rather than put it through this huge, heavy herbivore, make it produce milk,
circumstances,
remove its calves from birth from the cow, which is cruel, and then boil all of that water down, having gone through all of that, and so you form it's just incredibly inefficient. So that is not to say that you can't have I think ruminants have a really important role to play in some regenerative systems. So it's not that, it's just saying we reckon to hit the UK's targets by 2035, you have to reduce meat by about 30%, and by 2050, you have to reduce it by 50%. So, and that is what worries me about that is that unlike when we did all of the kind of the consumer research and we did our focus groups and we went around the country we had kind of citizens dialogues, everyone's really in favor of tackling junk food. They're actually up for it. The government is a bit lily-livered, is a bit nervous compared with where the country is. On meat, it's a very different thing. It's a very, well, as everyone will know who listens to this podcast, it is about the most contentious area. Yes. People hear, when you say something, people hear something else. It's to some people.
So how do we go about it? How do we, because it seems like it seems essential to take the pressure off, like to dramatically reduce the land use of feed and the grazing in the wrong places, because that's coming back to the 3-compartment model. We often graze, overgraze, don't graze in the right way. And of course, all the animal welfare pieces, which you vividly describe in the book. And it's not going to disappear overnight. It's not going to, there's a lot of health issues, advocates like Eddie, actually, who was mostly on I think a paleo or keto diet. Like, what are ways to, because by 2035 is tomorrow, basically.
Yeah.
What are ways to, I mean, we have the techno-optimists again, you quote Rethink X as well, like it's all going to be coming from a lab and or in a big fat, and the land prices are going to collapse over time or very soon, et cetera, et cetera. What do you see? Now it's a bit later. Of course, the book has been, you wrote it, the food strategy a while back. Like, in this current context, 2024, what do you think are significant levers to pull to get the pressure off?
So I think there are only 3 levers you can pull. So the first is the kind of tech thing. So we argue that for that ultra processed food, like over 50% of meat in the UK, and the same similar in America, Canada, is eaten in the form of a mince in an ultra processed product. So at the moment, all of the techno solutions to that have a problem, which is they don't taste as good as meat and they're more expensive. So we shouldn't be surprised that alternative protein hasn't cut through, because it's very difficult selling things that don't taste as good and are more expensive. But that's going to change. So I think the first thing to go will probably be, funny enough, egg yolks. So there are loads of egg yolks in kind of
everything,
quiches and this, that, and the other. Avian flu is a massive problem for that. Then it'll be milk powder. And I think there just will be a kind of technical substitution. And we argue that given that this ultra processed food stuff is so bad, you might as well use it to help you with the environmental stuff, because you're not immediately going to get people eating fresh food overnight. So you have to use the fact that it's there. So that's the first way that you do it. The second way that it happens is through changing public tastes. Now, that is, who knows whether that will happen.
That's an easy one.
But definitely, you know, I'm doing some work at the moment with one of the TV channels who wants to do a big campaign on eating less meat. I think it is possible, you know, with influencers, with Hollywood people, etc., that we do just begin to consume less. I don't know, but that's one route that it happens, that people, certainly in my, having done all the work on, and I was a pretty skewed case, but I eat just like nothing like, I'm really careful now about the kind of meat I eat and how much I eat. I eat many more beans. And maybe that shifts the dial. The third thing is that while it is completely politically impossible for government to act at the moment, going back to that stat I gave earlier on, by 2035, when climate change will be, it'll be much worse, right? It's going to get worse before it gets better, and agriculture will be producing potentially 50% of greenhouse gases. I think you might then find a route for government intervention. So I can see, for example, you know, it'll start with carbon border taxes. So taxing meat that's been produced from felled forests in South America, and gradually what is politically impossible now might change, because it'll just become so obvious, A, that this is a huge problem, and B, that agriculture is an increasing part of it. So I kind of think, you know, you have to, again, complex system, who knows? So you have to bet on the technical, on changing public opinion, and then on government intervention.
And then how does that fit with health? I mean, of course, if you replace the mince in ultra-processed food with a lab-grown one, probably doesn't change too much. But at the same time, we just talked about Eddie and others that are going on the health tour and eat real food. There's a lot of meat involved, or animal protein in a lot of those diets. I'm not saying all, but how does that, in a complex system, of course, you can have different streams, but how does that work in your head with let's say the healthy food, the ultra processed people side or food side, and also a lot of the research now that's coming out on healthy soil, healthy produce, healthy gut system, healthy people. Probably actually we should eat less chicken and pork if that done well. Actually, of course, different types of dairy, very different results. So how do you fit that into the junk food cycle and the healthy side of things?
On health, fundamentally, for it to be fixed, we need to have a complete cultural change. And I was quite pessimistic about that, but then I look back and see how many times our food culture has changed in the last 80 years. It's like, why on earth would you...
Sushi used to be dangerous. There were German tour guides written of, if you go to Japan, don't eat this raw food because it's very dangerous to you. And that was not so long ago, I think 20 plus years.
So we've changed our culture, like food culture, a lot before. And basically, Michael Pollan fundamentally got that right, which is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And so that is, and then at the same time, you need to try and reformulate the ultra processed stuff to make it less dangerous. But I don't think that eat food, not too much, mostly plants, cooking from scratch needs to include. I think the keto, Eddie, bless him, he's a bodybuilder, right? So he's obsessed by protein, and by eating enough protein, he eats like 20 eggs for breakfast or something. But I don't see that necessarily needs to become part of that shift. I do think that for that cultural shift to happen, we need to the role of state in that is to make sure that food, when you go to hospitals, the state provides about 5% of our calories, schools, hospitals, government buildings, and that needs to become the norm. There needs to be the good stuff, not the bad stuff. But I think, I don't think necessarily just because you're cooking from scratch, you need to eat 20 eggs and liver. I want someone to go and give Eddie some cooking lessons, because he does some amazing things. He does like this dish where it's like all in one pot, heated eggs and liver and avocados,
smoked salmon, avocados,
and all just like cooked up in a pot.
Sometimes you mix it, he blends it as well. But that's what I think the danger, and we talked about it pre-recording, it's amazing because it's from scratch, it's real ingredients, it's not too expensive. He really makes an important point about this doesn't have to cost you, because we buy liver, we buy eggs, they're not the most expensive things. But then I know from food science and health, like if you eat certain types of eggs, they can be really good for you or very inflammatory, depending what they ate. So we don't want this to replace one problem with another. But then we argue, of course, but if you come from most of the UK diet is extremely ultra processed going to at least what he's eating in a lesser. He also shows a lot of vegetables. He chooses not to eat most of those, but at least he shows them single ingredient things. It's way better regardless how they were produced.
And you're never going to get a perfect mouthpiece. The point is, what is great about him is wake the fuck up. It's just like this kind of like, look at it. Look at it, guys. Look what we have created. And that, that is very powerful. And he should be rightly, I think it's fantastic what he's doing.
Okay, so now we answered sort of the first question I always like to ask, and 1 hour and a half into this interview. Why are you doing what you're so? No, it's. I knew this was happening, and that's why it's so good. But I want to also talk a bit about Bramble Partners and the role of money and finance. And to let's summarize this first one we did with a question I like to ask. Let's say we do this live, we're at Groundswell or we're in London, and let's say the city, and it's full of in a theater full of investors and people in the finance sector. And of course they got your book, they are excited about the evening. But what is one thing we want them to remember after if they walked out? If there's one thing only for finance people managing their own wealth or pension funds, etc. But if they go back to work Monday morning and they remember the next morning and they remember one thing from our conversation on stage, what would that be? What would be the seed you want to plant in the finance world's mind?
Well, funnily enough, I would want to say to them, change the food system in your
wake the fuck up. No.
In your community. Go into your local school. That's where you go and ask if the food's good enough. Go into the food bank, help, because my theory of change, and is I'm not sure that like big finance, people who are currently in charge of large amounts of capital, I think they have limited agency in how they can change things. So I think you have, and I was talking about this the other day actually to someone who'd given hundreds of millions of pounds over their lifetime to nature restoring projects. So you have philanthropy, first of all. So, and this is like, by philanthropy, I mean stuff you don't get paid for. So for me, that would be the food strategy, it would be chefs in schools, it would be Sustainable Restaurant Association. So philanthropy, I think, can achieve two things. It can be a sticking plaster. So while the system is bad, it can help restore populations of certain ecosystems in various areas. It can help people who are struggling in poverty. It's a sticking plaster, but fundamentally, it's not sustainable because if the money goes, the benefit goes. The second thing philanthropy can do, and this is something I spend quite a lot of my time doing, is influence regulation, because fundamentally, none of this changes without regulation. So what do I mean by that? I was at a dinner the other day with a whole bunch of the sustainability people for all the big food businesses. I asked the question, when has your company ever done something to make your product healthier or more environmentally sustainable, which has significantly reduced your profits? The answer is never. No company will ever do that. So what they're doing at the moment is they're doing the kind of low-hanging fruit that turned out they were destroying the environment in all sorts of ways that were unnecessary, that they can fix without costing them anything. But as soon as they hit cost, they will stop. And so that's where you need regulation. And so regulation for me opens the space for private capital to move in. So if you think about electric cars, you start off with subsidies for batteries, subsidies for electric cars, government support, capital moves in, and then at a point they become, because of the regulation, they become cheaper they take over. So the customer drives the decision rather than government driving the decision. And I think that in the food system, what happens is the regulation changes what it is profitable to do. Then, and this is why I'm doing Bramble, there is a space for private capital to accelerate the speed at which that market develops. So Tesla, that private capital accelerated the natural transition which would have happened anyway. But you can only make it work if there's that government regulation there in the first place. So I think there is good. For me, it's like I've done all this stuff in the food system,
So why
which
a
largely
fund?
was
Why a fund now? What's the
because I've done the kind of
now?
philanthropic stuff, and I'm still doing. I mean, my philanthropic work now is going to be chefs in schools. I'm doing a piece of work on health where I'm interviewing all of the prime ministers and secretaries of state for health since 1990 in the UK and saying, why has it been so difficult, like from a politician's point of view, to make any progress? And I'm going to be publishing something on that. And I'm doing a bit of work on meat, but that's my kind of philanthropic stuff. And the question is, we sold Leon in 2021. What do I do like with the rest of my time? And what it struck me I could do is I've been privileged enough really to understand, to just have this view of the system through COVID, through everything in DEFRA, understand how it fits together, and can I help pull in private capital and focus on those areas of the food system that could be improved as regulation moves. So that's the thing of Bramble. How do I help entrepreneurs become successful, navigate the regulatory environment, and accelerate the change towards a food system that is regenerative, that sequesters carbon instead of emitting it, and that is healthy. And I think inevitably, for it to be sustainable, you need both the regulation, but you need people to work out how to create business models that don't require ongoing philanthropic support.
And with Leon, you were objectively early. and we discussed at the beginning of this, like you need momentum, and you're saying now like you need regulation, and then that creates space for private enterprises and companies and thus investors to invest in them. Are we there? Like, is there? You set up Bramble. I think the answer is yes. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it. But like, is there space now for these entrepreneurs to start potentially thriving because the government is starting to create, to use your analogy of electric cars, some charging infrastructure, some subsidies, some early signs of this could have wings?
So yes, but we are right in the foothills. So as I said earlier on, this is 12% of global GDP is agri-food, and it's causing $12.7 trillion of damage. And we are only beginning to get into the foothills of that. And so the implications that I see all the time, people who are trying to do businesses that I think the regulatory space isn't there for yet. But I think it will open. I think all the time now. I think the regulatory direction of travel, despite these little setbacks in Europe prior to the June elections, it's only going one way. So the thing is to try and direct the capital as that regulatory space opens up, to try and direct capital towards businesses that are helping farmers understand their regenerative approaches, that are reducing the CO2 levels of inputs, that are making pest control solutions less toxic, that are helping customers buy healthier whole foods, et cetera, all of that stuff. And I mean, funny enough, you look at RFSI and you look at my concern about some of the big capital is like people get excited and it's like, oh, we need to, we have millions of dollars waiting to go, and that can cause problems. So for example, in vertical farming and in alternative protein, you had these huge slugs of capital coming in, which actually moved the system quite a long way. But they fundamentally misunderstood that these are both farms; these aren't tech businesses. They're ways of producing food, and they're long term and big asset heavy businesses, and they're not going to give you big returns. I look at RFSI, the conference, and you can imagine money going in the wrong places, because everyone asked me, like, where should I be? I was in a meeting with one of the big banks who'd set up a food fund, and they'd invested in a certain business, and they were like, what do you think about this? And I was like, yeah, I think that's one of the businesses that's going to do quite well. Who knows? But they're in the right area. And they're like, oh, thank God. You can see them getting relaxed. So I do worry some.
We're at the beginning.
Yeah. We're at the beginning, and there's a lot of money that's going to go wrong way. There's a lot of Wild West stuff in terms of carbon capture and carbon credits. I worry that farmers are signing up to contracts on their land, long-term contracts on their land that they're gonna look back on and think, why did I do that? So there's all of that's going on. But we're right at the beginning. But it is the beginning, and it has started.
And so what are you? I mean, you mentioned a few things. What will be focus areas? You can check it on the website as well, Bramble. But just things that you're excited about. Are you mostly UK focused? It's a 50 million fund, and what are you mostly looking at, like in terms of an investment thesis? Yeah. Or it's like food system, it's complex, we do everything that we need to do if it's a good investment.
So our view is that what we bring is deep domain expertise. So we really understand the regulatory side, we understand the NGO pressures, we understand the commercial side, having the kind of, and the government side. And so we're actually going, in other ways, we're going quite broad. We're going to be slightly later. So we're starting at what's known as Series A. So those are businesses that already have revenue. They have a proven track record. So we can actually help them. They've got enough scale to be able to be helped all the way through to growth. We're looking all the way along the supply chain. So from the value chain, so right from kind of farm inputs all the way to consumer. And we're kind of agnostic about different business models, although we're not going to invest in those asset heavy things. The one thing that all the businesses will have in common is they will have to be able to do improve the system, either in terms of health or in terms of environment or in terms of food security or in terms of climate, or more than one of those things. But otherwise, and we're going to be, we hope to be investing alongside less expert capital. So people want us
bringing that in.
We'll be in the system. So people say, look, will you come into this business with us because we think it's got legs, but we're not the experts. And so that's kind of we hope to direct capital to the right place. That's the point of doing it. 50 million on its own in a fund isn't a lot, but if you are acting as a lightning rod to bring capital to the right places, then maybe we can shift the system a little bit in that way as well.
Which begs the question, a nice bridge to one. What if you had $1 billion? If you had that crazy amount of money that's trying to enter the space, this could be extremely long term. We always ask this question, like if you had an almost insane amount of money, we could argue, should it be concentrated in one fund or one person? But let's say that happened overnight for whatever reason. It has to be invested. So maybe a small portion you can use as grant and lobby power, because that would help the rest of the fund. But if I'm not looking for exact euro or pound amounts, but if you had to choose, like, what would you focus on? Is it the biostimulant side or the consumer good side? Or like, what would be top priorities for you to tackle if you had a lot of money?
The biggest gap, I think, is a public good. So it is something that government, I think, should be providing. It's quite hard for private people to provide it. And that is a combination of two things. One is we need way more research on farms. So at the moment, all of the research money goes into, or a massive amount goes into genetics, and just like a tiny amount goes into complex systems. And that is a big problem. So the reason
Which is a problem if you make a seed in a lab.
Yeah. So the reason that all the solutions are that shape is because no one is spending the money on farms really understanding the science. And then the second thing is, we go to Groundswell, we meet all these regenerative farmers. They're right at the cutting edge. They're interested. There is not nearly enough advice for farmers who want to make the transition. And so I think both of those things, I don't think I think they are things that the state should be providing. I would probably, if I had $1 billion, I would probably try and prove that was a public good. So it'd take one country and like massively accelerate the amount of research going into, or maybe in Europe, going into regenerative farming, on-farm farming science projects alongside farmers, and then using that knowledge to help a network of farmer support, and then hope that I could then persuade, over 5 years, show the outcomes that persuaded the state that this was a good use of their money.
And if you had then, let's say, a follow-up one to actually, let's say that happens, then of course it's complete pipe dream, wishful thinking. But what would you, if you had Bramble Partners, let's say fund number 4 or fund number 3, and it grew into a large amount because many people co-invested with you, but also many thought, I would just want to give the money to you and you do it, and I don't have to co-invest. Let's say you get to $1 billion, which is a lot, but not so much. What would you, and we're a few years down the line, what do you think are sectors or pieces of the sector you would get excited about from an investor, putting your investor hat on perspective?
So I would probably separate it into, if I'm allowed to do this in your question,
you could do everything
into two funds. So I think there is, I think we talk about health and environment. And to a large degree, although there is definitely a meeting point in regenerative cooked food, in legumes, in good veg, you could imagine a food system that was fully sustainable but unhealthy. So you could imagine a food system which was regenerative, where we still ate a lot of sugar and refined carbohydrates.
But regenerative sugar.
Yeah, but regenerative sugar, but it could still be pretty bad. Where we're still eating Mars bars, but they're created in a regenerative way.
In a super nice agroforestry system.
Yeah, exactly. So you could that world exists, and likewise, you can imagine a healthy world which is done in an environmentally destructive way. So you can imagine us eating a lot of fruit and veg.
20 eggs. Yeah.
Exactly. And yes, there'll be information. There'll be kind of around the edges, but you can imagine those two worlds. So I would split it in two. So I think there is really interesting stuff, tech now, which is helping people change the way they cook, shop, and we're just at the beginning of that. So you've got businesses that like Gusto, which are enabling people to cook from scratch. You've got businesses that are using AI to help people cook for their families much more efficiently. That's going to be, I think that people will pay a lot of money for that in the future. I don't know what the solutions are, but I think that is commercially very attractive. And then the other thing is that I think as we understand the complex farming systems, I think that measurement, monitoring of complex systems, different inputs, I think around, so I would separate it. I'd have a kind of farm area, measuring more on one side and then the health at the other side. And that would be two areas which I think are only going to grow and grow.
In your book as well, is these complex systems, we need dashboards, we need we need to understand, because we make small changes, we don't know what really happens unless we actually monitor properly in the 3-compartment model, but in general as well. And we need to adjust probably constantly because they are complex systems, but we can't if we don't have the data.
If you don't have the data, exactly.
Surprising how little data we have on biodiversity, like how few fields we actually survey properly, or on wild areas, or on grazing, or on methane, or on, like, most of this is model based or in labs and not outside in a complex system. So or on seeds, like, we have very little idea, which is super exciting because it means we can start measuring most of that and start tweaking a bit without fully understanding the system. I understand that, but at least understand it from 0.1% to maybe 1 or 2, which gives us way more lever to make changes and see if they have effect.
So I agree. So you were talking about methane modeling. Like we have no idea. Like if you look at the interaction between ruminants and soil and methane, it is so variable depending on what kind of farm, what system. We just have like no idea on that, and that is. Which
drives me crazy, and other people linked it as well, with these charts of our world in data and others. Like it's good to put it in your face, dairy, etc. But it's also good to understand that these are model based and some life cycle assessments that are not correct, to say the least. That doesn't mean it's not true. It means we need to, like, okay, let's see a diverse pasture system with ruminants. How much methane actually gets burped out, observed, and how much actually goes into that? We have no idea.
One thing that I think is almost certainly the case, one of the a man who's now become a friend, Paul Clark, who was one of my advisors on the food strategy. He was the chief technical officer at Ocado, which is a online delivery platform, but they built this extraordinary warehouse, which was a robot swarm. And
I've seen the videos.
And he said the other day to me, he said, look, I wouldn't even get out of bed without modeling it first. But then you link that model. They had a digital twin, so they had a version of that warehouse which lived completely in a digital world alongside the real one. And constantly the real one would share data with the digital one, but then they could say, what would happen if we had there's a Delia Smith cookery show coming on and she's going to plug this product. What do we think will happen to the warehouse if that happens? What do we think will happen?
Let's run a few scenarios.
What do you think will happen if there's a massive drought? What do you think will happen if
COVID?
So constantly you're running scenarios. I think it is undeniable that at some point in the future, almost any complex system that is really important to man, and farms, 50% of habitable land are one, will be similar. There will be digital twins of your farm. You will have measurement of all sorts of things in situ, and you will have a digital twin that is taking that data, suggesting inputs. You'll be trying things, and you will be dancing with that complex system in a much more technicolor, high definition way than you can dance with it at the moment.
Wearing your Apple Pro. Now, I'm laughing because we are part of it. We are a tiny part of a much bigger AI for soil health consortium run by or financed by the EU and specifically designed to do this, to make the digital twin of farms. And it's fascinating the point you make. I didn't know we were going there, obviously. So shout out to the AI for Soil Health team, if you're still listening at this point, if you're listening to this far. But it's the importance of that is not to be like how little we know and how much technology power we're getting now will enable us to at least observe more, to at least run different scenarios, to at least understand what if we bring more complexity into this monoculture field? How much complexity is complexity? Let's test, let's run, because you only have a few harvests to do that. And of course, you don't want to risk whole farms unless you have a research farm. Like, you cannot do that, but we have the technology power to at least understand most of the roads that don't work and then start trying the ones that do.
I think it's really exciting. I mean, one of the books that made a great impression on me that I read during the food strategy work was The Wizard and the Prophet by Charles C. Mann. And, a lot of your listeners will have read it. So basically he's saying you've got these two tribes, the prophet who is, wants a kind of natural response, and the wizard who thinks we can tech our way out of everything. And man says, they keep shouting at each other. It becomes a dialogue of the deaf, which would be fine if we weren't talking about the future of our children. And I think that actually
which would be fun if it would be nice entertainment, but it's not fun.
Yeah, it'd be fine. Yeah, but nice entertainment, but the future of our children. And I think what is really exciting about digital twins, the ability to understand systems of complex data, is actually you're going to see that the wizards and the prophets largely are the same people. They've just done it in different ways, And so I think it's going to be quite irritating, I think, for the prophets, because all the wizards are going to suddenly say, look, this is how complex systems work.
Indigenous knowledge.
So the prophets will be saying, hold on, we've been telling you this for 100 years. But I think that that ability to use science, not just focusing on one seed, but focusing on a really complex system, is only going to increase. And I think that's incredibly exciting.
How was it at those 2 days? I'm trying to get to a final question, but it doesn't seem possible in this case. But I wanted to go back to the two tribes you saw, or not the two tribes, but the 2 days you spent at the Sainsbury Centre. Like, how many of the seed scientists are aware that they're working in a complex system and the limit? Like, how I don't say it was a clash, of course, with the regen farmers, but how much of them were able to see that or acknowledge that?
I think most of them. So most of them were thinking, this is really interesting. How can I help you with like what I do? I think I spoke to one who was just quite arrogant and was like, no, you don't understand. You loopy fruit nuts. We'll solve it for you. And there were some people on the regenerative side who I want nothing to do with this at all. So, I, for example, cannot see why, if you could accelerate the breeding of a long-rooted wheat through gene editing rather than trial and error, as we've been doing for years, I don't have a problem with that. I think we need everything we can to throw at it. And there were some people who...
It's the same discussion with the weight loss drug. Yeah,
exactly. Well, it's slightly
there will
different
be unintended consequences.
It's slightly different with the weight loss drug, because what you're doing with gene editing is you're trying to create plants that will work in complex systems. So it's not the same. But the
risk is they don't at some point, and
but then every plant, if we had to go back to plants that were prior to human intervention, to human breeding, and then we'd be able to feed.
No, of course. But the risk is that you you interfere in as we're only eating a few crops and they have a massive amount of acreage, and all the soy is more or less the same type, all the chickens are the same type.
That is risk.
Like, when it goes wrong, like, the downside risk is so big and quite catastrophic, because suddenly we lose, for whatever reason we don't understand, because we tweaked something that was in a complex system and we thought we knew and we understood the whole risk, but we actually didn't. I think it's if you play with an apple or certain crops that don't have that huge impact potentially on food security, it's a different story. But if the downside risk is so big and we lose a soy crop a year, that would be the end of quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think that you have to be looking at risk all the time.
And it hasn't delivered.
I think we're in a situation where you can't apply the precautionary principle. You can't just stop. You can't stop the system.
So we have to. I mean, it depends. It depends if you're taking Nassim Taleb's view on, like, I don't want to butcher his quotes, but if it's a risk not to humanity, but if it's a big enough risk to, of course, if it's a localized risk, who cares? Let's play. Let's see how we get. Maybe we get the currents that produces enough, etc. But if it's a global potential risk to humanity, then we should.
Yeah, then you do it. Well, but that's exactly so. But that's not the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle says don't do anything that could be bad. The risk-based principle says,
no, I don't think
how bad is this going to be, and is this risk worth worth doing. And I think those are fundamentally...
We should get Nassim on here and explain to us risk. Nassim Taleb for those who didn't. But I think it's you need to take a risk to figure, but you need to not contain it, but know, okay, it's not going to take down the whole tribe, because then we have a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
And in its way, and we're far enough in the red that we have to experiment probably a lot more.
Yeah. But I think that most of the science, that increasingly the science will be going towards complex systems theory anyway. So I
have to, otherwise it fails anyway.
Yeah.
That's what we see. Yeah.
Exactly.
And as a final question, as we're almost 2 hours in, and this is already the longest interview we ever did on the podcast, which I really enjoy, I'm not saying it as a complaint. It's the magic wand question. If there's one thing which is super difficult to answer from all of your experience and work, but if actually only one thing you could change overnight in the food and agriculture system, what would that be?
Make people love lentils. So
what's not to love about lentils?
Like, people won't eat them. So, like, literally, people say to me,
"My children love lentils."
I know, but I love lentils. But, like, literally, so there's no one answer. People say, it's a complex this, and there's no one answer. If people ate legumes instead of 50% of the meat they eat overnight, that it would just we would buy ourselves so much time. And so, like, I say that almost a joke, but also it's not a joke, which is like, it's so simple and yet it's so hard because we are, I mean, it's a really good example of us being programmed, us being part of the system. So if I could globally hypnotize everyone to eat more lentils, that's what I would do.
I think it's a perfect end to this conversation. Thank you, Henry, for making the time on a Sunday morning to talk to us, to bring us an enormous amount of knowledge, wisdom, experience, and an enormous amount of energy as well, which you cannot see through the video because we don't do video, but you can definitely hear it through audio. So thank you so much for doing this and for the work you do and for coming on here to share about it.
Thank you. I mean, I think your podcast is amazing and I have learned a lot from it. So keep doing the good work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again and see you next time.